All right, so we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're calling in from. My name is Tiffany Rather, and we welcome you to this MindSite News Live. Today, our founding editor, Rob Waters, is in conversation with Simran Sethi, a journalist, author, and co-founder of the Asian Psychedelic Collective. This is the fourth in a series of live talks with people involved in the effort to create new mental health therapies based around psychedelics. We're doing these conversations to stimulate conversation and the exchange of ideas, to introduce ourselves to a wider audience, and to raise funds to enable MindSite News to better cover this emerging world of psychedelics research, policy, therapy, and commerce. At the top of our website, mindsitenews.org, you can sign up to subscribe to our newsletters and to make a donation. We'll place the links for those in the Zoom chat a few times during the course of today's interview. There will also be a Q&A portion of today's event, so feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box, and we'll answer as many as we can towards the end of the conversation. And now I'll turn it over to Rob.
Thanks, Tiffany, and good morning, everyone. And Simran, I'm really excited to speak with you, so welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm sorry we had to reschedule this. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I am sorry too, but I'm glad that you are. For those who weren't paying attention to our emails, Simran, we had originally scheduled this interview for a couple of weeks ago, and Simran is recovering now from COVID. I think you're mostly you're pretty well on the mend. Yes.
Pretty well on the mend. First time around, and just doing my best.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you were able to join us today and you're feeling better. So your work as a journalist and author has primarily centered on food and food justice. And then, like some other writers, including Michael Pollan, with whom I began this series of conversations, you turned your attention to psychedelics. And again, I think largely I would venture to say from a social justice viewpoint. So let's just talk a little bit about that progression. And start somewhere near the beginning. How did you first get so interested in food and in writing about it?
I think the interesting thing is I love to eat, so that's first and foremost. And I was always the one asking, like when I'd come home, like on college break, like when are we getting together with the family? What are we eating? Mm-hmm. It's always been first and forefront in my mind as a way to see the world, as the way to connect to family and loved ones. And so there was that on a kind of personal level. On a professional level, my work was always really focused on change. Like, how do we inspire and engage people? And I initially had started in terms of environmental work in a much sort of broader stance, but my personal interests again were food and agriculture. And I remember, like, I'd get trotted out for this television show that some of you may remember called the Oprah Winfrey Show. And I'd sort of come out for Earth Day. And the first year it was Leonardo DiCaprio and Al Gore. And the second year it was me sort of like stepping up to that position. I was the third one in that first year. And then the second and third years I was sort of in the front position. And I just thought to myself, like, what am I doing wrong that I'm repeating the same information that was shared by like a movie star and a former vice president? Like, if you didn't hear it from them, what can I do? What can I possibly say? And that led me to really dive into the psychology behind behavior change and starting to understand that it wasn't data that changed people's decision making, right? This is coming out of Yale University. Tony Lyserowitz has shared this in an interview I did with him. It was stories, right? Stories shape the way we see the world. And I also started to pair that with other things that I learned about, thinking about like a concept called the finite pool of worry, which is that there's only so much we can worry about at one time. So if I want you to care about something that I care about, Rob, I have one of two options. I can either work within your existing cares, or I can displace one of the things that's in your pool of worry, displace one of your worries. Now, I mean, I just met you, so I don't actually know what your cares are, but I venture to guess that you eat or you aspire to eat, and food is something that is sustainable. Right? Okay, excellent. So how about I go with food? How about I go with this thing I love and this thing I think you love, and how about I start to tell these stories through that artery, right? Through that lens. And so that's what brought me to food. And then that became, really a more acute focus when I started to look at the intersection again of food and environment around agricultural biodiversity, and specifically the loss of biodiversity.
Okay. And what about the role that your parents and your grandmother or grandparents played in your interest in food, and also the social aspects of both the consumption of food probably was primary, but maybe also the production of food and the cultivation of food?
Yeah, it's you know, I'm an immigrant to the United States, and going to grocery stores here is such a different experience, or even a farmer's market here in the United States than in India. And I'd go and visit my grandmother, and we'd go to the sabzi mandi, and there she is, like haggling over the price of like eggplant or okra or like tomatoes, and that it was a full-bodied, um deeply woven into the culture kind of affair, right? Like at breakfast, we're talking about what we're going to be eating for lunch, or my nani, my grandmother's already planning that, that there was this sort of, and then we're going shopping, right? And we're doing this every day or every other day, and that it was just such a central way of how we came together, and it was such a, I mean, there were moments when I certainly felt shame around it. I just wanted to eat a bologna sandwich in a Tupperware container. I didn't want to have these gorgeously prepared Indian meals my mother had made. And that is a very hard thing to kind of look back on, my small girl self, who wanted something that came out of like, in plastic wrapping versus like this food lovingly prepared by my mother that other students later, would have coveted, and that like now is like, a cuisine celebrated everywhere. But recognizing just that it's food is something that directly ties into who we are. It's not just caloric nourishment, it's not just calories that are going into a body. It's culture, it's history, it's identity, it's how we come together. And it is something that we can actively shape as eaters. I love the term that Carlo Petrini from Slow Food uses, co-producers, that we help shape the food system. And it felt like, coming full circle on the kind of Oprah moment, it was like talking about light bulbs had a very different emotional connection than saying like, we can eat differently, we can feast differently, we can help save biodiversity by savoring our food, right? And that just, that's juicy. That's juicy work. It doesn't feel scarce.
Absolutely. So yeah, at MindSite News, we're focused on mental health, but we know these things are all connected. And I bet you could make a strong argument about the relationship between what you eat and the pleasure, the nutrition, and the sense of well-being that's derived from that. And not to mention the physical and mental well-being of the people who produce the food that we eat.
Without question. And if you look at like even thinking about the gut microbiome, right, and everything that we're learning now about how deeply this is connected to our mental health, the notion of prescribing, psychiatrists and doctors prescribing healthy foods and fruits and vegetables, as a way to help people optimize their well-being. I think that's emerging now, but that's something certainly in Indian culture that there's been a cognizance of that. We wouldn't have named it as such, right? We wouldn't have said this alleviates depression, but we would eat certain foods for certain things, right? According to Ayurvedic principles. And so I think like this knowledge is there, and some of it's being unearthed, some of it's being explored for the first time. But we all know that we feel better or we feel worse depending on the kinds of foods that we put in our bodies and the kinds of environments within which we consume the foods. Are you alone in your cubicle eating leftovers, or are you like sitting across from like, your beloved and having a candlelit dinner? Like it could be the same food, but you're going to have a completely different experience of it.
Yeah, and you wrote, a really interesting piece, and then after this, we'll switch to talking a little bit about psychedelics. But you wrote this very interesting and disturbing piece last year about the situation of children who work growing and harvesting coca, and that's used in the chocolate that we all consume in this country and throughout the world. And talk a little bit about the I mean, talk about trauma and mental health, what those kids experience, and what so many producers of food in the developing world experience is, part. It can't really be separated from, this, mental health. Mental health is having a moment right now, the mental health crisis, but these issues are there all the time, and they're contributing to people's emotional and the child development of these kids, their brain development, all of those things.
Absolutely. I'll just clarify, coca is what becomes an end product of coca is cocaine, but cocoa is
Yes.
is the crop that we're talking about here. And yeah, there's a lot of heartbreak around the cocoa supply chain. This is a challenge of child enslavement that particularly, we see this challenge. The largest producer of cocoa in the world is West Africa. Cocoa originated in a bean-shaped area, between Ecuador and Peru, and was domesticated in Mesoamerica. And there's a bit of evidence that maybe there was also originated in Mesoamerica, but that what we see is that the massive amount of production is coming out of West Africa, and it's it's an extraordinarily lucrative industry. But what we have seen since I think it was the late 1980s is the amount of money that's apportioned to the farmer has plummeted. And even with certifications, Fair Trade International did a study a handful of years ago showing that that despite these certifications, that farmers are living in extreme poverty, and extreme poverty is awful, especially when you're thinking about earning your living from a crop that is suffering the impacts of climate change, right? So there are multiplier effects at work here, and to say that there was something when I was writing my book, I spent 5 years on 6 continents meeting people who were at the origins of our food, farmers who for no other reason than they knew the importance of this, were preserving this biodiversity that we need to sustain our food supply going forward. And I remember, talking to someone about cocoa in particular, and that there was that if we could remember, like, all their love and care was being poured into this crop, that would ultimately become this product. And thinking about the epigenetics of trauma, this is something that lives in generations. So going back to the case that you're referencing, I'd written about a case that went before the Supreme Court, led by Terrence Collingwood and IR Advocates. It's International Rights Advocates. Terry Collingsworth. I hope I said his name right the first time. And what they found was, if you read this testimony you mentioned, it's really heartbreaking. It's children, 5, 6, 10, 11, 12 years of age, who had been trafficked from Mali and told that they would have work and they would be fed, being smuggled out of their country and being put in places where they were harvesting cocoa. You harvest cocoa with heavy duty machinery, machetes. And there's all kinds of toxic inputs that are put on the crop. And when they tried to leave, they weren't being fed, they weren't being paid. Some of them were caught, were not fed food. They had their feet cut open. Guards urinated in the wounds. But this is extreme trauma for a food that we use to heal our broken hearts and to show people love, which meaning chocolate, right? So I don't want to belabor it, but I really urge people to learn more about the work that Terry's doing. iradvocates.org, I believe, is the URL, and to really start to ask and understand the complexity of this supply chain. Ask suppliers, where is their cocoa coming from? Have they guaranteed that they're not working with child labor or extreme child labor? I think would be hazardous is the official term, hazardous child labor. But to be more mindful that when we go for the cheapest chocolate, it's not the executives that are losing money, but it's these people who are already at the margins and at the bottom who are suffering even more.
Important point. And I mean, is there some legitimately free trade and fair trade, sorry, not free trade, fair trade chocolate that you would that you would suggest, or a good place to research that at least?
Yeah, I could spend 2 hours talking to you about this.
It's
I
not.
would say that what would be a great thing for people to do is there are some lists out there that list, slave-free chocolate. My number one suggestion is to look at craft chocolate makers. The price point of the chocolate will be higher, but the ethics will likely be stronger. The way some of these smaller companies are procuring cocoa is going, and meeting farmers and having actual relationships with the people that they are sourcing cocoa from. Good Now Farms comes to mind, Askinothi chocolate comes to mind, Crew chocolate comes to mind. You can look on the filings of the Supreme Court case that you'd mentioned. The chocolate companies that signed on to the amicus brief is another shorthand list of some really good makers who really are supportive of ensuring that this sweet confection that we love isn't born out of suffering.
Great. Good. Well, let's move over to psychedelics now. So when did you first become interested in this area, and did it come out of a personal transformative experience of some kind for you, or was it more born from broader social concerns?
So
Or can you distinguish between the two?
yeah, I've had experiences with psychedelics for several decades. In terms of intentional experiences, I, like many, suffered mightily during the early pandemic, and really the depression and anxiety that were always part of my constitution really rose up, and I was ill-equipped to manage the depth of my pain, and spent a lot of time in Mexico, actually, in near isolation for a fair amount of time. And when I finally arrived back in the United States about a year ago, I had a friend, suggest to me psychedelics, and I started microdosing psilocybin, and this was after weaning myself off of the antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication I was taking. And this is not, I'm not prescribing anything to anyone. I'm just simply sharing my journey. In being able to do that, I realized that there was an alternative. And then when I actually had a larger set of experiences with both MDMA and psilocybin, what I realized then was that this idea that like MDMA or psilocybin works on, the default mode network and helps alleviate symptoms of depression and anxiety or PTSD, or that now the long list, right? Alcoholism, depression, everything that we sort of see stacking up, that it tells a clinical story, but not maybe the full story. And what I mean by that, Rob, is that no one had told me that what I would experience in that journey, that experience that I had, those macro experiences with psychedelics, was forgiveness, self-forgiveness, healing in this profound way of, a connection with my father who had passed away, of feeling the presence of loved ones who had passed, ancestors, of coming out of the experience with a profound sense of gratitude and a belief that the world was good, a belief in connection, a feeling of love. This stuff wasn't there, but to ignore that is to sort of overlook a tremendous part of what healing is, and what I believe healing from mental challenge is. The relationship I have with psychedelics is one that is a relationship. What I had with the medicine that I took, the pharmaceuticals, the antidepressant and anti-anxiety pill I took, was that it was externalized to a pill. When I took the pill, I felt maybe less anxious, but I kept jumping up, when the doorbell rang, or, I couldn't sleep, and I was supposed to tolerate these side effects. And also, if I didn't take the pill, I wouldn't be well. Whereas now, whatever is happening and has happened is a relationship that I actively cultivate with myself every day. And that is just the most profound change that I could not have known going into those experiences.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I'm So I'm interested in your work in a couple of different areas. You know, that's your personal experience, and that's informed your work. And you've worked in a couple different areas that I think are just really interesting. One is the Asian Psychedelic Collective, of which you're a co-founder. So I'd like to hear about that. And the other is the Fireside Project, the psychedelic peer support line. So let's start with the collective. When did it form, and why, and what's been your involvement?
If you don't mind, I'm going to flip those two things because there's a chronology to this that I love to share.
Okay, absolutely.
So coming out of these profound experiences, right? And wanting to, when we talk about psychedelics, you know, we talk about the set and the setting, right? So what's the mindset, the intention going in? What is the setting? You know, what is the substance? Like, what is the experience of consuming the psychedelic? And there's also the understanding around integration. How do we make sense of the experience that we've had? And, you know, and what I had my experiences in group settings with wonderful people, but they had no understanding of my culture as a South Asian immigrant to the United States. So when I walked in, I had a photo of my grandmother, you know, I had stuff for our altar, and, you know, I'm seeing, you know, statues of my gods. I'm Hindu and Sikh, you know, like, of, you know, trappings of my history, my story, right? That run deep. They're not something that I use as decor. They're something that I have a direct connection, an intimate connection to. And, you know, we're listening to the music, you know, we have headphones on, we have eye shades on, we're listening, and, you know, there'll be things that come up, music that comes up that might be just sounds, an enjoyable soundtrack for someone, but me hearing some Westerner mispronounce a chant that is sacred to me is a different kind of experience.
Yeah.
And unintentional, right?
Sure.
But in that liminal state, when so much can come in, it really touches in a different way. And then coming out of the experience and wanting to, you know, talk about, like, my mother being on a boat going from Uganda to India, you know, and what it meant for my family to have to flee Uganda when Idi Amin came into power, you know, or my father as a refugee, you know, fleeing Pakistan, walking from Pakistan to India. We don't learn this in American history classes, right? There was no container for what I needed to process. And so I felt a longing for this kind of support. Shortly after, and I really want to uplift this, Chakruna Institute has a whole psychedelic justice series. And you mentioned justice as a part of my work. It's the spine of my work. And so I was absolutely delighted to see this curriculum offered. I was in their very first class, and the first class was on diversity and you know, in sort of psychedelics. And I just remember a moment where I started to see the other Asians on our Zoom screen, right? Which is something I always do. Who are my people? Where are they? And we started having chats in the side, you know, and connecting with each other. And, you know, what we were doing when we were looking at diversity felt like Asians were still many times falling through. You know, there's so much challenge that needs to be addressed, particularly around racial trauma. And the dominant conversation, and I think in many cases, rightfully so, needs to be centered on what has been overlooked in this country, which is Black trauma. But as an Asian, I'm in this funny position of being like invisible and hyper visible, you know, being othered, being minoritized, despite the fact that 2 out of 3 people on the planet is Asian. You know, like, there's this funny thing that goes on. And then there's this model minority myth that comes in that sort of makes everyone think, you know, there's this success thing going on, which is true and not true, and is built on extraordinary, you know, sacrifice. And all it takes to assimilate, to come to a new place, all these things are in the mix, right? When you're in your psychedelic experiences. And I started to realize, like, we need to be having these conversations where we need to open up what diversity in psychedelics looks like. And at the same time, I'm accepted into this wonderful affinity cohort at Fireside Project. Fireside Project, for those who don't know, is a warm line for anyone who is actively tripping or trying to integrate a past psychedelic experience. I think now it's like, gosh, I'm going to mess up the hours, but not quite 24 hours, but 7 days a week, from 11 a.m. Pacific, I think, until late into the night. And you can find out all that information on firesideproject.org or through their app. But what they did was offer a way to talk about your experiences, with someone for free, confidentially. And when I read that they were starting this equity initiative, I just thought, I want to be there. I want to be the kind of person that I didn't have to support me. And the affinity cohort comprised of veterans, trans folks, and BIPOC folks. And within that BIPOC section, there were I think 10 of us of Asian descent. And we had a kind of a separate gathering within the training, and we just looked at each other. And I remember saying to the group, this feels like home. And it was the first time that most of us had ever seen someone who looked like us in this space. I can get very emotional about this. So there they were, these big seeds being planted. We have a need, right? And even when I was, when I couldn't find that integration support after my experiences, I sought out beautiful offerings, specifically from the Psychedelic Liberation Collective and the Ancestor Project, BIPOC offerings, where I was in circle with people of color. But again, there was a need, a yearning for specificity, a yearning for those who understood what it meant to show up here and have to leave your culture behind, what it meant to lose your mother tongue, to not maybe be able to communicate fully with your own grandmother, to not be able to see your family, to try to fit into Western culture, whatever that meant, and what it means to leave behind what your identity is. All these things that are held within our bodies and within our psyches. And so as I continued to have these conversations, I just was in such gratitude of the learnings that I'd had at Chacruna and then the experiences that I was having at Fireside, that we realized that we needed to put something together. So I started to talk to people. I scoured at first, first it was the folks in the Fireside Project and in the Chacruna classes, hey, can we talk more about this? A little in the side chat. And then it was me scouring LinkedIn through, doing a search on psychedelics, looking for anyone who had a name that I thought might be Asian, and reaching out and creating this crazy voluminous document and sending it to people. And, I think it's now I've spoken with 80 people across the continuum of psychedelics. Everything from commerce to venture capitalism to therapy to research, to advocacy. And it just, I'm filled with joy to say, we're founding this organization. We're launching our first community gathering for Asians on December 10th. And what we want to put
soon.
Yeah, soon. What we want to put in motion is just an opportunity for belonging, first and foremost, but to help people feel that even though maybe they haven't seen themselves in the dominant narrative, this sort of white Western narrative of psychedelics, that there's so much there that is, first of all, in global South culture. I would invite everyone to sort of close their eyes and run through the list of people that they know in psychedelics, and then sort of track the race and the gender of those people. And I would venture to guess that the majority of them will be white men. Beyond that, there's rich culture, here that we really need to explore more deeply and honor more deeply. That psychedelic history is just as diverse as psychedelics themselves. And I think beyond that, looking at clinical trials, that representation is again skewed toward white folks. There was a review of 17 studies that was done by Jamila George, and also Monica Williams was part of that team. And I encourage everyone to look at this research that's out there, because it's emerging and it's really important. But that, over 80% of the people in clinical trials that were participating were white. And 2.2% were Black, 2.2% were non-white Hispanic, 1.5% were Asian, 4.7% were Indigenous in this one review. It was a review of 17 studies, and it was the studies that had been done between 2000 and 2017. And then, of course, recognizing a lot of studies don't include that ethno-racial data. So So helping people to understand that they belong, that, advocating for participation in clinical trials, advocating for greater presence in trainings. As you well know, Rob, it's really hard in all types of health, but particularly mental health, for people to seek help, especially those of color. And looking at just Asians alone, that it's a situation where, like, we're comprising, like, I don't know, 7 to 8% of the population, but we're at such low numbers seeking mental health support because of how stigmatized it is. So I think we need to see people who look like us in the movement. We need to uplift the people in the movement who look like us, who are already there, who maybe aren't getting the attention of the people who are in leadership positions, and need to create a space where people feel safe to, if appropriate, to explore psychedelics and learn more about them.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the issue of the composition of clinical trial subjects. That was one of the areas I wanted to get into with you. But are there clinical leads, are there investigators now who are taking that message on and sort of saying, we've got to do better in terms of the recruitment of people taking part in clinical trials so that it is more representative?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to name it, and then it can be addressed, right? And I think,
Right.
and especially researchers are head down, just trying to secure, the medicine, going through all their hurdles to just access the substance, right? To get their research funded, to get their research off the ground, that maybe this hasn't been, top of mind. But now that we see the momentum, and we see what's happening around, the FDA and what looks like on the horizon approvals, for MDMA, for specific clinical usage, and then later on, hopefully for psilocybin, that and then that coupled with decriminalization efforts, that we see a loosening of that, and that there is a little bit more space to say, all right, so who are we, who's here, who are we supporting? And again, I'm going to uplift Monica Williams as a researcher who's really looked, I think, probably more than anyone that I can think of, looked at the makeup of these trials. So I'd really recommend people seek out her work. But then again, I think there's an important piece that must not get overlooked, and that's around recruiting. It's not simply enough to say, we want more Asians, It's like, all right, cool. So how do we do that? How do we make sure the invitation is one that is accessible, right? And I'm speaking to Asians here because I am one, right? But every one of these conversations needs to be had with Black participants, with Indigenous participants, with Latinx participants, that I can speak to a part of this pie. But generally speaking, there's the cultural piece that really needs to be considered. I was looking into some research from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and it was looking at white healthcare providers, and they were kind of reporting back on sort of like what was their background in sort of cultural competency. And 56% reported that they hadn't had any cultural competency training. And this was also coupled in that same, I think, study looking at that, that they said that they thought that over half of their patients weren't adhering to medical treatments because of cultural and linguistic barriers, right? So you can see here, this isn't specific to psychedelics. This is endemic, not only to mental health, but health across the board. So
and it's absolutely, a problem throughout mental health. And I think you referenced the low level of help seeking in your community, in the Asian community. And I think that's true across the board for racial and ethnic minorities in this country, and in large part because they don't see people like themselves doing the clinical work, being the healers or the treaters in the traditional medical system. So that's also a huge problem that needs to be addressed. And that, and in a way that brings us to the Fireside Project, back to the Fireside Project, in the sense that is a source. We have two problems. I mean, in terms of mental health care in this country, I think there are a couple of problems that run on the same track. One is that there's a huge lack of clinicians in general. The demand is rising exponentially. My wife's a clinical social worker. She, a psychotherapist, she is turning down people every day who are calling for help because she's simply overwhelmed, and so are her peers and colleagues. And that's in the Bay Area, where there are therapists, on every other corner, it seems. So thinking about other communities and other places, the need is just immense. And one of the things that the peer support movement can do is, while they are not clinicians, they are not, clinically licensed people who can dispense psychotherapy or medications, they can do a lot to provide, support and assistance to people, especially people who have been through the mental health system and have that lived experience that they can share. So it struck me that the Fireside Project in this one area of psychedelics is just well poised to do that kind of work. And I'm interested in how does that peer support line work? And are folks who are engaging with the Fireside Project also interested in broader aspects of peer support?
So I am a volunteer on their line. So I'm definitely not, I can't speak for every part of Fireside Project, but I will say that the emphasis here is on peer support. So there are trained therapists, nurses, social workers, writers, all kinds of people participating at Fireside Project as volunteers. We show up to support the people who call in, who are, again, actively tripping, having a psychedelic experience, or trying to integrate a past psychedelic experience to whatever extent possible, with that affinity support for trans folks, veterans, and BIPOC. And what that really involves is reflective listening. We're not there to offer therapy. We are not therapists, but what we are there to do is offer support. And it is, the data is out there. That support matters. People who feel isolated, who might feel isolated in their experiences because of the nature of this, not only, again, there's so many things we could be talking about, Rob, but, there's the underground nature of psychedelic substances. There's the stigmatization of psychedelic substance use. There's the real fear for certain communities that have been targeted through the war on drugs. I'm talking specifically about African Americans and Latinx communities that have suffered mightily, right, for drug usage, or the perception of usage that at some rate that is not in any way, shape, or form higher than the general population, and in some instances lower. But that for all these reasons, and for the financial piece, you were talking about your wife not being able to increase her caseload anymore, there's a real financial barrier here to access to care. So to me, Fireside Project is like psychedelic mutual aid. We're here to support each other. It's solidarity. It's not charity. There's no hierarchy here in terms of the relationship between the person calling and the person answering the call, and that it's a form, though, of care that is sorely needed because of the sort of underground nature of this. A lot of therapists are struggling because they can't risk their their licensure to offer this kind of support sometimes, right? So I think that there's just a lot going on that will evolve over time. But what I think I'm most grateful for being part of Fireside Project is that it's democratizing what support looks like in the space, and by offering a free service to people who are in real need. I think what's most challenging for me is the fact that some people who are being overseen, for example, in clinical settings, maybe, or taking something like ketamine at home, maybe have been sort of taught about the substance, but haven't been given a ton of support on the back end to make sense of the experience that they have afterward, to understand, to feel supported and held as they're going through the processing of what happened to them in their psychedelic experience. And that's where the magic is, it's there. And to not be held in that moment, I think is a travesty. So that's why I think, Fireside is so important, because it's really meeting a need that needs to exist in every kind of setting where people are consuming psychedelics, I think.
Absolutely. Well, I want to ask you in a minute about some of your experiences on the line, what kinds of calls you've gotten when you've, in your volunteer shifts. But before I do that, I just want to pause for a minute and say that a little bit about MindSite News. We're the only dedicated journalism site in the country dedicated solely to reporting on mental health. And we've organized this series of conversations to examine the role that psychedelics can play as a mental health therapy, and to explore where this effort is going. MindSite News is a member of the Institute for Nonprofit News, and that makes us eligible for Newsmatch. And that means that this month and next, through the end of the year, every donation we get is matched dollar for dollar. So it's a good chance for folks to support us and have their money go twice as far. So you can go to our website, mindsitenews.org, and click on the donate button at the top of the page and help us grow our reporting on psychedelics and all aspects of mental health. You can also sign up there for our daily newsletter. So back to the interview. Tell us, when I don't know how often or how many volunteer shifts you've done on the peer support line, but I'm really curious about what the nature of the calls is, and also logistically how it works. I assume you take people do the shifts from home, because I'm sure you're all spread out. How do the calls get forwarded, and how does that all work?
Well, the technology platforms are actually, I believe, in the process of changing and being mainstreamed, but we do connect virtually. We're all over the United States. The service is available in the United States. And I think volunteers can also come in from elsewhere, but the call-in line is US based, and we work on 4-hour shifts once a week. And that's sort of the support that we offer. The calls range. I mean, they're all confidential, so I can't really speak to the nature of any of them. But I think, certainly that there's a continuum. So going from someone really just trying to understand, is this normal? Like, I took X and I'm feeling Y. Is this normal? Or I took X and I'm having an amazing time. And oh my gosh, I just want to share to my friend took X and I'm scared and I need to know what's going on and I don't know how to support them, to someone took X and we need to call emergency services to make sure that they're getting the care that they need. On the integration side, it's really I took X, XY, XYZ, and I've had this experience and I need to talk it through. Is it okay to talk it through? I had this thing come up and I'm really struggling with it. I had this thing come up and I can't tell anybody about it, and then there's an ear, there's a voice. And I want to circle back, because I feel like I didn't do this justice earlier, in talking about sort of the experiences of Asians. There's a lot that gets buried for a lot of people, and it will come up in these experiences that we have. It's something that is the nature of the medicine, right? That we see that when people are in this sort of state, like that, even in tiny quantities, psychedelics can act as sort of non-specific amplifiers, and kind of make things bigger than they have been, things that have even been buried. And there's so much that doesn't get talked about here around the trauma that Asian people have faced, and it's something that gets obscured sometimes by an understanding that Asians have a certain educational level or certain socioeconomic demographic, or in a certain socioeconomic demographic, and that doesn't tell the whole story, because that's not all Asians, first of all. But I think more importantly than that, it's that what people don't know, what doesn't get written about in history books, is that the Korean War was the third most devastating war of the 20th century, behind World Wars I and II, or that the partition between India and Pakistan and Bangladesh was the largest and most violent political migration in human history, or looking at the 20 million Chinese who died in World War II, which was more than 60 times the number of Americans, or understanding that even here on Turtle Island, what we call US soil, that, our textbook will say something like, there was anti-Chinese sentiment in America in the 1800s, but it won't tell you that the largest mass lynching in US history happened in Los Angeles in 1871 and wiped out, 10% of the Chinese population in one day. We don't hear about the hate crimes against South Asian Americans that has increased by more than 500% since 9/11, or the number of hate crimes rising against, Asian people. I think more so East Asians, but that's up, 150% from 2019 to 2020 alone, right? That these things get silenced or they get hidden, and they don't get talked about. And so it's like, we're the ethnic, the racial ethnic group that has the greatest income inequality, but has also strived so hard to assimilate. And so then what happens is, all of this stuff gets buried, but it won't stay buried forever. And it lives on, through the epigenetics of our ancestors, and comes through us. And then that stuff that we have to grapple with. So I hope that as we move forward in this movement, as much attention as we're giving to veterans, that we also start to look at climate refugees. The largest group of environmental refugees are coming from Asia at the moment. That we look at the victims of war, a tremendous number, Afghanistan, Iran, that are also, again, coming from Asia. That we start to realize that the work that needs to be done needs to be inclusive of all people, not just for the sake of diversity, but for the genuine sake of healing and of alleviating human suffering.
Well, thank you for that. So I think we do have some questions from our audience. So bring Tiffany back in, and she can share with us some of those questions.
All right, thank you, Simran and Rob, for such a great conversation. So we have a few questions. The first question is from an anonymous attendee. How is the mission and or work of the Asian Psychedelic Collective serving not only Asian American stories and mental health, but also bridging rifts between Asian Americans and the home country culturally and on a mental health level?
That's a beautiful question, and it's one that I hope to have an answer for in some time. I say it in this very abstract way because we're still coming into being. But one of the core tenets of the organization is to serve all Asians, and that's what I like to call big A Asians. So East, West, Central, South, diaspora, but forge those connections back to Asia itself. And those rifts that are mentioned are real. And I think that this can be a powerful tool for healing. But one of the things that concerned me, that I'd heard, someone in the space say, who is Western and not of Asian descent, but was talking about Asia as a market for psychedelics, and bringing psychedelics to Asia. And first of all, cannabis originated in Asia, and we have a whole history of entheogenic usage, in Persia. It's in our Rig Vedas in Hinduism. We've got some. But second, and more importantly, when we're talking about the ones that we kind of think of as classic psychedelics, that these medicines need to be offered by Asians for Asian. And so whatever the Asian Psychedelic Collective can do to support that, we wish to do. At this stage, I don't have an answer because we're still in chrysalis state. Our slow emergence will happen on December 10th, and we'll be launching our offerings in January on Lunar New Year. So that's definitely something that will come in the future.
And is there a way for folks who want to get in touch with the Asian Psychedelic Collective, and maybe in advance of your December 10th debut, to do so?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that. AsianPsychedelicCollective.org to join our mailing list and get information about that event. And also Instagram at Asian Psychedelic Collective, and hello at AsianPsychedelicCollective.org as an email.
Great. Tiffany, more questions?
Yeah, so you kind of touched on this in your last answer. It's a long-winded question, but it has good parts, so I'm just going to share it all. This is from Samrita Misra. As far as Hindu philosophy and Vedic sciences, do you wonder how the ancient sages were able to enter such deep meditative states, seeking the answers of the universe that were presented to them, often very accurate? Is it fair to think that perhaps they partook in psychedelics to enter these deeper realms of receiving information from a higher source? Secondly, why do I feel a bit sheepish that maybe that was the case? The stigma of psychedelics bothers me, maybe because I'm a healthcare provider, an Asian American model minority. Are these feelings influenced by post-colonialism?
Yes and yes. How about that? Absolutely, there is documentation of of substances, entheogenic substances being consumed. Soma is our god as well as the substance, and then similar. There's Syrian rue. There's a host of entheogens that have been used that to achieve these transcendent states. And I'll also say that the sages and the mystics also sat in meditation, right? Have also used pranayama, breath work, to achieve these altered states, these transcendent states. So this is part of our lineage. This is part of who we are. The stigma around this is also very real. No one in my family wants to hear about me and my depression. No one wants to talk about, I'm saying family, big family, little family, all family. We want to put these things in the closet. We want to keep them buried. The fear is that you open it up and then lots is going to come out. So there's that stigma around that. And then anything to alleviate that suffering will be also stigmatized. But I think there's a very real concern, because these are not legal substances like that they do need to stay quiet. But I will tell you that the people I've been able to speak with, I mentioned I've spoken to over 80 people. The number one thing that I have received from those conversations is people saying, I feel, maybe not these exact words, but I feel seen, right? I feel heard. And I think that's part of that colonization, that I think a lot of people maybe who've only had the experience of the United States don't recognize the enslavement and the colonization that have occurred throughout Asia by the British, the Dutch, that there's the French, the Portuguese, that we have also been carried to places against our will, that we have had to migrate, forced migration and voluntary migration. But that I think that for me, all of this is bundled up in the idea that we have to be a certain kind of way. And the colonial influences of that are still living within us. So yes, I again come full circle and say yes to both those questions.
Great. There's another question that's come from Sopai Duke. And she says, Simran, you're speaking straight to my soul. I'm Cambodian American, and my community has been impacted by the Khmer genocide, the Vietnam War, and French colonialism. I've been looking for ways to lift up our stories and incorporate it into our healing journey. Can you please speak more to the December 10th event? Is it open to the public?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, it's free. It's open to people of Asian descent who are working in and with psychedelics, or who have a desire to. I humbly request that this container be held for people of Asian identification, bicultural Asian identification included. There will be offerings that we have that are absolutely wide open to everyone, but this is Asian specific. And what we're going to do is really get together, see each other, learn a bit about each other, share a bit more about the mission, vision, and values of the Asian Psychedelic Collective, share what our initial offerings will be when we launch in late January, introduce the people who are in the collective and some of our advisors. This is all time permitting. We've got 2 hours, and then end with a sound meditation from one of our community members. But this is our chance to really start to see each other and to know that that, you know, when you say I'm speaking to your heart, I just want to say thank you, because that's what we want to be. We want to be speaking to each other's hearts in community together. The number one identification of the Asian Psychedelic Collective is it is a space of belonging. So this is meant to be a homecoming.
Great. We also have a question from Justin Ayala, who says, can you speak about the psychological barriers that keep individuals from engaging with issues related to racial injustice and the environmental crisis? Do you believe that psychedelics can help Asians be more effective agents of change in these contexts?
Dear Justin, thank you for your question. Justin's someone who's familiar to me. I want to say the barriers to the psychological barriers to environmental engagement are what I focused a fair amount of my work on. And that is really, there are a number of factors, right? But all to say, I think the number one sort of takeaway for me was what I shared earlier about the finite pool of worry, that there's only so much we can manage at one time. It's not necessarily that people are bad or that they don't care. And those are defeatist kind of attitudes, right? There's certainly now more research that's come out that sort of says along political lines, people who have this identification or that identification have more or less interest in environmental issues. But what is interesting to me is some of the research that is emerging around psychedelic usage. There was a new study led by Kelly Paterniti talking about this very thing of like, does psychedelic usage enhance environmental behaviors, right? And there's no causation there. There's correlation possibly. We don't know, like, are people who are more environmentally inclined eating the sacred mushroom? Like, are they already predisposed to wanting to engage in psychedelics? Are psychedelics what, you know, inspire pro-environmental behavior? These have not been done, you know, in double-blind studies. There hasn't been any sort of clinical setting. This has been self-reported. But I think just anecdotally, you know, I think what we know is that that sense of oneness is something that, you know, Mary Casamano has spoken about from Hopkins, Anthony Bosick from NYU, that this is one of the things that people emerge with from these experiences, that sense that we are all connected, and not just we as humans, but that sense of interbeing, that connection with all living things, all living creatures.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place to stop. Simran Sethi, thank you so much for joining us. It's been super interesting. I want to say that, you know, folks who are not watching us right now can see this. We had an audience on YouTube Live and on Facebook Live rather, and this, you know, we'll post a recording of this conversation to our YouTube page so it can be broadly shared. And thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.